Hello and welcome to our new series, Joining the Dots by Qubit. The series will explore the impact of global events on India. Today, for our first show, we are joined by Tejeesh Singh Maini, who is a visiting faculty at the Jindal School of International Affairs at the OP Jindal Global University in Sonepat, Haryana. He is also a former SAV visiting fellow with the Stimson Center, Washington, D.C., and has also been a public policy scholar with the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy. Welcome to the show, Tejeesh.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
So let me begin by asking you, the major global event that happened last year, the Russia-Ukraine war. More than 1 year has elapsed. So how do you see that now shaping up, and how do you see its impact on the region?
Okay. So you see, the first thing is that it's very tough essentially to predict because as you know, I mean, it's over a year. It's nearly 14 months now, actually, since this sort of conflict began. And people have been making various predictions about how, one side may sort of give in and, So I think the first thing which you need to look at is that first of all, what have been the global reactions and what have been the important global events, and its importance essentially on the global geopolitics beyond just the great powers. So I'd like to just look at a couple. So firstly, the first point which you need to look at is that even before the Russia-Ukraine war, a number of commentators of international affairs had begun to speak about the waning US global clout. Right now, the decision of many countries to take a neutral stance, including India, for instance, which has purchased oil, which is looking to improve its economic relations. Then Indonesia, that also took Indonesia, and coincidentally, India is the chair of the G20, and Indonesia was the chair of G20 before India, last time. Now, when you use this, this neutral stance is often used as a reiteration of the fact that in the globe that sort of the global order is obviously changing, and in the Indian context, it's called non-alignment 2. If one looks beyond that, it said that okay, it's because of the that middle powers are beginning to see that the US is losing its clout, so they have to balance out, they have to see their own interests. So the first thing is we have seen a number of countries, as I said again, taking a neutral stance, and many countries which have very strong relations with the US otherwise. And India is a perfect case of that. That's the first thing. Then when we look at, post, and recently even Japan has said that it will, buy Russian oil above the oil cap sort of set up by G7, right? So that is also very important. That now, if you look at the power play, it's very, I mean, obviously China is trying to show that they'll bring about peace, and Xi Jinping also recently came up with a sort of deal and all. At one stage, when the war began, it seemed that okay, that that the US and China behind the scenes they were moving towards a working relationship, and the US was happy that if China played the role of intermediary and somehow brought an end to the conflict. Even at the G20 summit last year, also in Indonesia, the meeting on the sidelines between Biden and Xi, and between other Western leaders and Xi Jinping, it gave the impression that the US-China ties, probably there will be some sort of thaw. Now that hasn't happened at all. That hasn't happened, and even after that, tensions have continued to rise. And the next major bone of contention is Taiwan, right, between the US and China. And here I would also like to bring about the fact that when if we just go back to like about 2.5, 3 years back when the coronavirus COVID-19 started, it was not just the US, but even UK and EU whose ties began to deteriorate with China. And on the issue of Huawei entering the 5G technology of these various countries, they've all taken a similar stance. They have not allowed Huawei to get into the 5G network, and that was more because of US pressure. But what has happened in the past few months is very interesting. That a number of EU countries And recently, even Australia said that it needs to rework the relations with China. While relations may not be as good, Australia has said that while relations with China may not be as good as they were earlier, EU countries have I mean, especially France has categorically said we cannot toe the US line vis-a-vis China. So, so on the one hand, you have a difference on the Russia-Ukraine war, and on the other, even countries which are close to the US have a difference now, even on the issue of how you deal with China. So, the geopolitics has become more complex, and this is largely linked to the Russia-Ukraine war, because that is what has started this whole thing about middle powers taking a balanced sort of stance, and it has given space. So, many, for instance, after the Russia-Ukraine war, there was talk about the revival of the Iran nuclear deal. Iran has been selling oil also. It has bypassed sanctions. Many countries have actually been bypassing sanctions. So the Russia-Ukraine war, apart from the bilateral aspect, has really had a tremendous impact on the global geopolitical scenario. And it points to, at least for now, a waning US influence globally. Now, whether this necessarily means, the rise of China or not, that is a different issue. That because that we discussed later on also, there are a number of obstacles to that, uh, which I will highlight. But I think as of now, everybody wants to play the powers, while China wants to play the role of an intermediary, the middle powers also all want to play, the role of an intermediary in help. I mean, India has played a very proactive role, for instance, also in flagging, not just, it has said that, this is not an era of conflict. It has pointed to how, the global supply chains have been impacted. So has Indonesia. So you'll have, there are multiple things which have arisen out of this, and including, and some of the other geopolitical developments also are linked not to the Russia-Ukraine war, to this broader talk about how the global order is changing.
Right, right. So you mentioned one interesting point about the waning US influence in the region. So, as somebody who's an expert in, geopolitical relations, I wanted to ask you, is it by design or is it by accident that the US influence is waning in the region?
See, I think first of all, a number of realist scholars in the US have been arguing for long that US should take, it should not be involved in all global conflicts. In recent years, there's a consensus, both a section of the liberals and the realists, they have become more inward looking. And there is something called, in the US, there is something even called the Quincy Coalition, that we should focus on our domestic interests. And in fact, this was called, in the past, this has been referred to as imperial overstretch, where you can't handle, you're so involved in conflicts in different parts of the world that you can't handle it. Of course, the reason why why the US became more involved was because at one point of time, about 20, 30 years ago, there's a consensus between the liberals and the realists on the aspect that, the US is the dominant power and nobody has been as influential ever. And there was this talk about US exceptionalism, right? Now, that has begun to gradually, over the past 10 to 15 years, that's begun to change. Now, the question is very pertinent about whether this is by design or whether this is happening due to the situation. Now, I think initially it was definitely, but if you look at not just Trump, but even during the Obama presidency, there was a focus on, sort of becoming a bit more inward looking at US interests. In fact, that is why, if you look at Obama 1, the focus was on Afghanistan, and then Obama 2 also, some part of it obviously is focused on the Middle East. But there was a sudden shift also towards, there was a realization that we can't only focus on these areas, we should also focus on Asia. That's why the pivot to Asia, which has now become the free and open Indo-Pacific, that all. But last few years, what has also happened is, also need to see the style of the Chinese leadership. That is also shaping, the global order. Even if the US wants to take a particular approach, it is not, the US is not the only determining factor. It's also because China has changed its approach from, lying low and biding its time to a more aggressive, to a Chinese narrative. So Xi Jinping, he talks about, terms like Chinese dream and greater Chinese influence and things that, okay, so for instance, the increasing emphasis on XYZ with Chinese characteristics, right? And in the last 3 years, there has been a further change Because till about 2018, 2019, Xi Jinping spoke. Even now, references are made to the global order about keeping the global order intact, globalization and all. But if you look at the economic policies, if you look at other issues, clearly there is a deviation from that. So I think the aggressive style of the Chinese leadership, that has also changed things. Then obviously COVID-19, then you have things that, like for instance, in events like the imposition of this National Security Act in what happened in Hong Kong 3 years ago. That also got the West together. Then in areas like tech, all the Western countries are taking a similar stance. So I think it's a mix of both. But now US is not, I mean, it's not that if the US wants to plan things in a particular way, they will pan out that way. I mean, Afghanistan is a perfect instance. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan and how it's drawn flack from other countries. But at the same time, I think we should be very cautious. The US decline to some extent is but natural. But does this necessarily mean that, the way some people think that by default, that China is going to fill that space? I think there's a big question mark on that.
Right, right, right. So I would also, coming back to the first question that I asked, and, it was related to the Russia-Ukraine war. And one of the most interesting things that was observed in the course of 1 year was, I mean, this is significant because this is probably the first time that a so-called third world country is coming to the aid of a superpower or a former superpower. The supply of drones by Iran to Russia. This was significant, even though I think initially the Iranians denied it that they were supplying, but over the course of time, it has been revealed that they supplied thousands of drones, unmanned aerial vehicles to Russia. So what does this indicate? Is it the superiority of Iranian military tech or hardware, or a shortage of military hardware, in the Russian camp? And the irony is also not lost, because I think it was Ayatollah Khomeini who had, termed the US as the great Satan and Russia as the lesser Satan. So for him, both were Satans. So, Iran and Russia have never had a very cozy relationship. So how do you view this development and its implications, on the region, going forward?
I think we need to view this. Obviously, the first is that Russia wasn't left with many options. Okay. I mean, that is quite apparent. There were options, but there were limited options given what has happened over the last year and the pace of events. The second is Iran has also not been left with two. You see, because the West has pushed Iran towards the China-Russia nexus, towards that camp. I mean, because look at the Iran nuclear deal. Initially, the US gave indicators that they were getting back to the table. Now, you see, if you look at the state of the Iranian economy, if you look at inflation, if you look at all that, it's not left with too many options. And anywhere, if it sees economic benefits, obviously it is going to lap them up. And remember, this happened when the game-changing event, which we'll come to later, hadn't occurred. That is the agreement with Saudi. That has turned the tables totally. That will now. But this event specifically, I really don't think that we can go into any granular details about the military aspect. But it has a certain, I think, the geopolitical symbolism and messaging that was very clear. Right. And Iran initially denying it was also because, I mean, that can be attributed also to the fact that it wanted to keep the doors open with the West regarding the Iran nuclear deal. In fact, that is one of the reasons after the sale, more sanctions were imposed by the West. So I think the US and Europe and UK, I think there has been there has been no clarity with regard to engagement with Iran also. And even this, some concessions could have been made, even if you didn't want to come back to the 2015 version, this could have been done in an incremental way. And with Iran, with its back to the wall, then you see, for instance, it signed a 25-year agreement with China, strategic agreement 2021. I think it's also in the process of working out a similar agreement with Russia also. Now, under that rubric, a lot of things will be done, economic and defense and all that. But I think there was no, and one more point I would like to say that, domestically, if you look at the Iranian public opinion, they are not very happy about being part of any camp. Because in 2021, when the Iran-China agreement was also signed, there was a lot of domestic opposition to that. So Iran does not, having had a bad experience earlier, it does not want to, become appendage to anyone. That is very clear. So I would look at this in the larger geopolitics and the fact that Iran was left with no alternatives and the challenges which Russia is facing. No doubt, Iran-Russia relations have strengthened, and there are some. When we look at India, I mean, there are some examples. There's a lot of trilateral cooperation also, and the possibility of that.
Right, right. So you mentioned this point about, the Chinese, brokering the Iran, Saudi Arabia, the peace deal, which, had been in limbo so the last, I think, 7, 8 years, ever since that attack happened. So, uh, from China's perspective, the most obvious benefit is the easy access to oil. And I
Mhm.
believe, there also this pipeline talks, are underway. But from a larger, perspective, especially from India's perspective, how worried should India be? Because if you look at it now, China has, close relations with Russia. Then, of course, North Korea is there. And, South China Sea, it is already, claiming that it has complete sovereignty over there. Uh, to India, South, Sri Lanka, it was already there, Pakistan, and now with the West Asia also in its camp. So in a sense, do you feel that China is encircling India in an arc, and should India be worried or concerned?
See, this deal specifically, if this the impact of this deal on the region is an outcome of the deal. I don't think the deal happened because China had. This is a much larger, if you look at the Middle East, it was about basically, certainly in the last year and a half, China's, I mean, China is sitting pretty in the Middle East in the sense it has good ties both with Iran and with the Gulf countries now. It's managed to balance that out, right? But I see an opportunity for India, especially in Iran, because the pace of investments has been very slow. Chinese pace of investment. And China has actually invested much more in Saudi Arabia. So the key for India is the Chabahar port, right? The, the progress of the Chabahar port. Now, there have been complaints. I mean, there have been certain differences about the pace. But Chabahar port is very essential for connectivity to Afghanistan and beyond. And then the international north-south transport corridor also, INSTC. I think already some pilot, I think some last year this was used for India-Russia trade also, that route. I think some sort of pilot initiative happened. And INSTC will help India in linking up to Europe as well. So obviously, I think the India-Iran relationship is very important. I think the Iranians, for instance, want India to start purchasing oil. They have stopped buying that. There is no doubt that, obviously, the more China gets a foothold, it does have strategic implications. But you really can't do anything about that. You see, you have to increase your strength and leverage. So, I mean, the focus, for instance, should be on the Chabahar port. How can you use it for enhancing connectivity? How can you strengthen ties with Iran? And India also, at this point of time, does have its own independent relations with Saudi Arabia. And we must also remember that Saudi Arabia is also balancing, because Saudi Arabia is still, I mean, whatever they may say publicly, they can't just, I mean, they have a very close relationship with the US. I mean, days after this agreement, they also made an order, I think, for some aircraft from the US, right? There was the whole thing. So I think you see, when you look at any geopolitical issue, there is a number of factors. And when you do the scenario building, you can't do the scenario building purely based on one. You have to keep that at the back of your mind, but that cannot bog you down. And you have to see that what steps can you take to increase your leverage. And today, so for instance, vis-a-vis China, I mean, what can be done is, okay, the Chabahar port is the progress. In fact, Iran has recently also told India, has made a statement that India should treat this as an opportunity. And they have spoken about an Oman, Iran, India pipeline. And the fact that, even at the Chabahar port, they will try to seek investments from Saudi Arabia and UAE also. So I think you see, thing is, you can't only look at things from a zero sum perspective. You have to also see opportunities, right? And you have to deliver on those opportunities and work sometimes within the constraints. That's how I would look at it.
But from Iran's perspective, if you look at it, posing up to China and Russia, does it sort of expect a quid pro quo, for its nuclear program? And, ultimately, there are fears of the West that, whether, valid or invalid, that's another issue. But should Iran go the nuclear way, because China has helped Pakistan, to an extent for its nuclear program. So if Iran also gets that help, shouldn't India be concerned? Because, it already has two nuclear armed neighbors in its neighborhood, and Iran with the third, even though relations with Iran are currently cordial. But would India be sort of willing to play the dice for having Iran go fully nuclear if there is a quid pro quo between China and Iran on that?
See, again, from a very practical standpoint, it's a factor of power. If it's a matter of concern, what can you offer the Iranians, and how can you shun them away from this, right? And I think the Iranian this whole talk of the nuclear program, I think there is internally, if you look at it, there is again, there's the Western narrative sometimes is very simplistic. There are certain dissensions within Iran also, and I think a lot of this is posturing. Because you can't compare Iran today to North Korea, for instance, right? Iran was left. I mean, it was a leverage that if you don't do this, then we will go ahead with it. Right? And they have. I mean, there's no doubt that they've gone ahead with it. But then you need to keep, how do what are the steps which not just India, which other countries can also take to shun Iran away from this. But then if they're left with no option, then they'll move towards China, they'll move towards Russia. But and that is where I think even the US China relationship also, a working relationship is essential, because again, in spite of all the tension, the US was also using China to tell the Iranians, not to move towards this nuclear program. So, and also look at global geopolitics. There are a lot of complexities. So, for instance, China is close to Iran, but China has been very cautious about investing in Iran. Why? Because of US sanctions, in spite of all the tensions. Look at, this whole thing about, there was such a talk about de-dollarization. Even that has not been able to pick up to the extent which people thought. Because, the US dollar still is dominant. If you look at the reserves, global reserves, I think it's 55% of them are still the US dollar. 2007, it was 69%, but in 2022, it was 55%. So, I mean, I don't want to sound simplistic, but, within all these events, you need to look at the shades of gray, unless there are some major issues.
Right. But, you brought up the topic of de-dollarization. So, I mean, you mentioned that, from 69% it's come down to 55% if you look at the global reserves. Obviously, it takes time, but do you see this sort of, gaining currency, going forward, that more and more countries, will be trading in, either their own currencies or, not taking the US dollar? Do you see this sort of gaining strength?
Yeah, over a period, I mean, so for example, ruble yuan trade has increased, but it hasn't worked in the case of India, Russia. In fact, Russia itself recently said it hasn't worked, to the extent which it should have. Uh, Even the Russians also don't want too many, rupees, and some of the Indian traders also, they're more comfortable with the model as of now. So I think there will be regions where this will work. Now, I think South America is also looking at such an arrangement. But obviously, as you write, this won't happen overnight. This is something which can pick up. You can reduce your dependence upon the dollar. To what degree? Only because these are all, these initiatives have just started. And they simply put their incremental sort of, pilot projects. And this ruble yuan trade also, there was no alternative. In fact, I think both Russian central banks have also been buying even more gold to reduce the dollar reserves. Even that has been happening. But, in international affairs, geopolitics, all, it's very tricky to make predictions. You can do scenario building.
Okay. So let me conclude this by asking you, reverting back to the first question that we talked about. So the role of the middle powers. Uh, Now, one of the terms that we had used was the non-aligned movement. Now, the old non-aligned movement was de facto a Soviet bloc. Everybody knows that. Uh, do you think even the new middle powers, whether it's India, Iran, or China,
Indonesia.
Indonesia, so again, is it the same, old wine in new bottle, or is this new wine in new bottle?
No, certainly it may. Well, there are ingredients of the old wine, and there are similarities with the old bottle. That's how I would put it. But look, now, if you look at the global order, if you look at all these countries, if you look at the growth in their economies, things have changed a lot. So as I started off, that once economically and insecurity wise you're more powerful, your options increase. So the relationship between the middle power and the great power, that changes. So great powers are wooing you rather than you choosing that which great power you go towards. So that is one of the major. Now you don't have, you are not going to Moscow or Washington. Both Moscow and Washington are, and it's not, one is obviously India is there, but even if you look at ASEAN, there it's between China and the US. So if you notice, one day there's a US delegation in ASEAN, they're talking about the Indo-Pacific. One day you have somebody from China talking about the RCEP, right? Now, but the difference will be there will be no big blocks. So you will have a lot of this plurilateralism, like trilateralism. So for instance, on the one hand, let's look at this region. You have you have the West Asia Quad, that's India, UAE, Israel, and India, US. On the other hand, you also have the India, French, UAE trilateral. Now that India, French, UAE trilateral is basically a balancer.
Right.
Because both France and UAE are now balancing. Right? So you won't have those big blocks, and you won't be dictate. There'll be no, ideological baggage for every issue. You may have a larger stance on issues, but so for instance, on environment, right? You could have differences with China on numerous issues, but on environment, you will go along with China on environment, on climate change. So that's how it is. So I think the major difference is going to be one. Obviously, these countries are in a far better position. The world order has changed. If you look at Asia, it has become the engine of growth. Obviously, China and India, they need to negotiate their differences. You need to see how that pans out. And then you have these small, these groupings, these trilateral groupings at various levels. Then you have, the contexts will vary. So for ASEAN, the choice will be between China and US. For India, the choices will be, India is in no place, given the relations with China. China is out now. That is one clear. So that is why whenever we talk about the US decline, whenever we sometimes talk about India moving closer to Russia, we probably lose sight of the fact that India has also become very pro-West in the last few years. If you look at the Quad, and as far as China is concerned, that is a clear alternative. So you may go along with Russia on many issues and take on the US also. But you also have to keep at the back of your mind that as far as the China factor is concerned, you're firmly entrenched in the Quad and all. So it's also been called, non-alignment 2 is one word, but you can also say that since you have so many choices, it's what is called multi-alignment.
Right.
In fact, policymakers have also called it multi-alignment. Those terms have been used.
Well, thank you so much, Tejeesh, for that insightful analysis. And it was really a pleasure speaking with you. And we hope to bring you back again soon. Thank you so much. And that concludes this program. Thank you and goodbye.